Well, in the first half of chapter 2, we saw a story of Jesus turning water into wine, which I think it's safe to say everyone was a fan of. The bride and the groom and the guests and the master of the banquet were all blessed by that, and Jesus' disciples who knew what had happened, they were amazed, and it increased their faith in him. So by the end of that event, I think it's safe to say that everyone was feeling better about Jesus. He kind of gained fans, you might say. He certainly didn't make any enemies through that. When someone is trying to establish themselves as a public figure, one of the things that they are very careful to avoid is offending anyone. So a politician doesn't want to say anything too offensive because he wants people to vote for him. A celebrity doesn't want to do anything that will look bad because then you might not buy their album or watch their movie or something like that. It's all about gaining followers and keeping them. And so, as strange as it might sound, one of the things that convinces me that Jesus is the Son of God is that he didn't bow to public opinion. As we go through the book of John, we're going to see that at times Jesus had thousands of followers, and then he would say something or do something that would offend them, and his popularity would take a hit, and many of them would leave, and he was okay with that because he was more interested in speaking the truth than in making people comfortable. And if he were just a man, and this is just me, but I think if he were just a man trying to prove something, trying to establish himself, he probably wouldn't operate that way. But what we'll see throughout this book is that Jesus had such a sense of being on a mission from his heavenly Father, that that's what mattered to him. And the opinions of the crowd didn't matter nearly as much. So right after that really fun story about the water being turned into wine at the wedding celebration, we have a very different story in the second half of John chapter 2. When it's time for the Passover, it says that Jesus goes up to Jerusalem for the festival. Now, the Jewish law required that 3 times a year, as many people as could come would go up to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices and participate in these religious festivals. So Jesus is doing something here that's joining a big crowd of his fellow Jews, and they're all coming together for the same thing, and he would have done this his entire life. But on this occasion, Jesus decides to call attention to something that everyone in society has accepted, but it's very wrong. Because everyone is coming for the Passover, and kind of the main event is the offering of sacrifices at the temple. But that has turned into a bit of a business. There's a whole racket that kind of surrounds the fact that you had to offer certain types of animals and use certain types of money, and it was taking advantage of these travelers who were coming to offer their worship. And Jesus is disgusted by it. And so it says in verse 15 that he made a whip out of cords and drove all the animals out of the temple courts. Just picture that, what a scene that would have been. He scattered the coins of the money changers, overturned their temples, and then he yells at those selling doves, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." So this is a very different side of Jesus than we saw there at the wedding. He's not afraid to cause a scene. He's not afraid to make people uncomfortable when he sees something that is wrong. And again, this was something that had become so accepted that no one questioned it. So the religious authorities come in this chapter and they challenge Jesus. They say, "How can you prove your authority to do this? Show us a sign." Remember, we talked about signs in the last video. They want a miracle. But Jesus is not willing to play their game. He's not a performing magician. So instead of doing a miracle, he says, "Well, if you destroy this temple, I'll raise it again in 3 days." That's a statement that makes no sense to them. They think he's talking about the massive building. He's talking about his own body, his own death and resurrection. So it's a statement that won't make any sense for a couple of years. And Jesus is fine with that because, again, he's not ruled by their opinions. And I want to read to you verses 23 through 25 at the end of that chapter because they just sum up so well what we're talking about in this video. It says, "Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person." Jesus wanted people to trust him and to believe in him, but because he knew how fickle people are, he didn't get too attached even to their praise. He just wanted to please his heavenly Father. And again, to me, that's just one more reason to believe that he is who he says he is.